The second lecture today is about lending and stablecoins. We will not dive too much into the details of stablecoins. Also, I mean, as Dan said, also on Monday, right? We could really speak like an entire week about stablecoins alone, I guess. But I will try to pack as much as possible also in this lecture. But to kick this off, like why take on debt at all? Like why would we do lending? That's a weird idea, no? Why do we have lending at all? Yeah? Make money, okay.
It's access to liquidity without exposing yourself to price.
Access to liquidity without exposing to price discovery. What do you mean by exposing to price discovery? The last part?
Like without exposing yourself to like the variance of assets.
Without exposing to the variance of the asset. Okay, so you just want to get a bunch of upfront capital, then forget about the money and just work on your product. That's
I haven't worried about like without like exposing assets to price.
Oh, I see. Nice. Okay, you're coming from the angle that you want to speculate on actually the collateral or the thing that you borrow, right? Like you're looking at it in the form of a swap, actually, right? I feel. Is this what you're suggesting?
But that's just like how big capital markets works. Because you have some asset that you need to be able to access liquidity in, but in order to get that, you don't want to expose yourself to the price discovery of that asset. You don't want to say, hey, the price is X. You want to keep open optionality if the price will change in the future. So eventually you have to back to liquidity without exposing yourself.
Okay, cool. Yeah, another?
It's like a basic economic tool to advance over time, right? Like I give you something that you don't have today, and then you can use it to make something tomorrow that is worth more. But if I don't give you that something tomorrow, then you never get it tomorrow.
Absolutely. Yes. So imagine this young fella here, he wants to buy a turntable, right? But he doesn't have the money to buy the turntable. So what can he do, right? He can go to someone else who maybe provides the credit to buy the turntable so that he can start creating music, right? So it's a very fundamental economic principle to take on debt, right? To produce something. And there's this, I think it's about 30-minute YouTube video from Ray Dalio. He was he still is involved at Bridgewater Associates, right? A hedge fund. And he explains how the economic machine works. And it's a really good video that I can recommend you watch. So there are these three things. There's a supposed productivity growth. There are short-term debt cycles, and there are long-term debt cycles. And these debt cycles, they emerge because people take on debt, right? And if you overlay them, then hopefully you see something like this, right? Where over time, if we assume that there's a growth in GDP, we kind of see like these kind of cycles. So yeah, I don't want to spoil this video any further, but I can really recommend you check this out because it's just it's quite interesting to observe. And on-chain, we also have this concept of debt. So on the blockchain, we can have a smart contract that creates a vault. A vault is nothing else. It's just another term for having a pool of assets, right? Where you can collateralize, for example, here Ether or DAI or some other tokens. And then you have a variety of entities, most notably the lender. So that's the entity who provides collateral, who deposits a principal here, and wants to earn interests on the capital. Very similar to a liquidity provider in an AMM, right? So then you have a borrower. So the borrower provides a security guarantee to be able to borrow something. And typically they first collateralize some amount of assets, and then they can borrow given the collateral. So the amount that they can borrow depends on how much they collateralize. Then we have third-party actors, and they can liquidate a debt position. And this liquidation is the emergence of a spontaneous market which is a market between the collateral and the debt value. So you can think of it as really just an AMM with fixed price, or like a one-time offer, take it or leave it, right? And for this to work, we also have price oracles, because as we discussed on Monday, blockchains are isolated databases. They cannot communicate with the outside world, so somebody needs to report prices towards the smart contracts for them to understand the value of a collateral. Because if you cannot price a collateral, then you don't know whether your debt position is healthy or not. So just to give you some UI examples here, we have, I think the first one here, this is Gervais, right? So these are some of these lending, these are basically lending platforms, right? Where you have a deposit API, you have a borrow API. APY is annual percentage yield, right? So that's the interest rate that you pay or you get depending on what we're looking at. There are also platforms where you can have leverage beyond 2x, which we won't discuss today. We unfortunately don't have time, but I mentioned them briefly on Monday. And you also have here, this is actually this is an AMM. I hadn't had the time to look into, to discuss this morning stablecoin AMM or packed asset AMM, such as Curve. I really recommend you inspect how different the bonding curve looks like in packed asset AMMs. It may surprise you. So it's quite interesting to look at the technicalities there. All right. So before we dive into further details, let's just go through the terminology. So a collateral, this is really the asset that serves as a security deposit, right? So the borrower provides a collateral. We speak about over-collateralization if the borrower has to provide more collateral value than the value that the borrower takes out as a loan, right? And under-collateralization would be the other way, if the value of the collateral is inferior to what the borrower can take out as a loan. Under-collateralized loans only work if the borrowed amount is tied to a specific purpose, right? So if you have a smart contract that will take the money and do something with it, but there's no arbitrary code that you could execute as a borrower, right? Otherwise it would be unsafe on-chain. A liquidation is really if the value of the collateral is below a certain threshold. For example, in MakerDAO, which we will look at today, this would be 150% of the value of the debt. And what's important, the liquidation is really like an anyone can take transaction, anyone can take market. It's a spontaneous market that emerges. And your position can become liquidatable if your so-called health factor declines below 1. So let's look briefly at how the health factor is defined. So here there's the sum of the value of the collateral. You may have multiple assets as collateral, right? In the most simple case that we discussed today, you, for example, use Ether as a collateral, but you could have multiple tokens as collateral. And then you have a liquidation threshold, and this liquidation threshold can also be specific to a given asset, but the health factor is then the ratio to the total value of debts that you have. And what's interesting is also the above term, it kind of defines your borrowing capacity, right? How much you can borrow. So the more you collateralize, the more you can borrow. So the health factor is typically between 0 and 1. So, and the liquidation threshold that we have provides this secure margin for a loan, right? And when the health factor declines below the value of 1, your borrowing position becomes liquidatable. Let's look at a particular example of how this would look like. So let's assume we have here, so the light blue is the collateral. That's the security you provide to the smart contract. And the blue value, that's the debt that you would like to borrow, the debt that you take on. So let's assume here you collateralize 1 ETH, and let's assume that the exchange rate at that point in time is 1 ETH is worth 2,000 DAI, right? So then your borrowing capacity, in this example, let's assume it's 1,500 DAI, so you can borrow up to 1,500 DAI. Why would you not borrow 1,500 DAI? Yeah?
You might immediately get liquidated.
Exactly. So if there's a slight price decline in Ether, right, then your borrowing capacity will go slightly below 1,500 DAI, and you will get immediately liquidated. So you want to have some wiggle room, so to speak, for the price to fluctuate. Very good. So let's assume, just for the sake of this example, we're happy with a health factor of 1.2. So we take on 1,250 DAI worth of debt, right? So the smart contract will take our 1 ETH as a security, and we have now access to the 1,250 DAI. So we kind of have more money now, right? We have the 1 Ether, it still belongs to us, but we don't have access to it. It's locked in a smart contract, and we only get access to it if we pay back the debt. But we have now 1,250 DAI. So what do we do with the DAI? We could do whatever, right? We can buy more ETH, then we have a higher exposure to ETH, right? We will have the 1 Ether plus the additional Ether from the debt. But as it happens, the value of the collateral can decline. So let's assume now that the value of 1 Ether goes down from 2,000 to 1,600 DAI. That means that the borrowing capacity that we have is now also lower. It's at 1,200, and our health factor is below 1. And that means we are, at least the step position here is open to liquidation. Okay. So we will go through one liquidation example a bit later, but before I want to quickly go into further terminology. So the liquidation spread, right? That's the bonus, or that's the discount that this third party, the liquidator, can collect when he's liquidating a position. And that's the incentive to perform a liquidation at all. Right? If you don't provide an incentive, then probably nobody will liquidate, and then the debt position becomes unhealthy, which is not good for the lending platform as a whole. So we have also another parameter that's quite relevant in a liquidation mechanism. That's the close factor. This is, roughly speaking, you can think of it as how much can I liquidate in one go? Right? What's the maximum amount I can liquidate? So it's the maximum proportion of the debt that is allowed to be repaid in a single fixed spread liquidation. Yep. Okay. So over-collateralized lending, borrowing, right? So we already discussed, we have this vault, right? So in the case of MakerDAO, for example, here the borrower collateralized Ether, and then he can borrow DAI, right? And if the value of Ether exceeds the value of DAI, if the value of the collateral exceeds the value of the debt, then by a certain margin we are safe, so to speak. If you look at lending platform dashboards, so here we have a screenshot of the Aave platform. So you can see in particular we have here 10,000 DAI that is provided as a deposit. That's our security. And here we have 500 uni tokens that we have borrowed, right? So that's just one example of how you can use these platforms. And it will tell you a few statistics, for example, how much you borrowed in US dollar, what's your collateral, what's your health factor, right? 5.3 seems rather healthy, right? So you definitely could borrow more if you want to be a bit more adventurous. So really to explain the details, right? So the individual steps. So it's really, I hope it's really crystal clear for you. So in step 1, we collateralize the Ether, for instance. Here we send it to the MakerDAO smart contract, right? That's the vault that we looked at earlier. And then you're willing to draw DAI, to mint DAI from that contract. The contract is happy to mint this coin for you. And afterwards, if you're happy to close that debt position and you haven't yet been liquidated, you can pay back the debt, which is DAI, and the smart contract should give you back the Ether, right? So that's kind of the normal healthy cycle. However, if the prices of the coins drop significantly, right, we can become liable to a liquidation event. Now, before we dive into the liquidation mechanism in DeFi, I would like to make a short parallel to the liquidation practices in traditional finance. And this can happen for a variety of reasons, also for entities, companies, but also individuals, right? You can have a rather complicated process until an entity is liquidated, and this takes quite a while, right? On-chain, this process is rather quick and simple, right? But just to give you an analogy, right? This, like the concept of a liquidation is nothing new to DeFi, right? This has existed for years in the traditional finance domain.
Sorry? What does it mean to be liquidated, concretely, that you lose what was lost?
Excuse me?
What does it mean concretely to be liquidated, that you lose what was lost?
So if you take on debt, right, you create, you first provide a security, which is the collateral that we discussed, right? In the traditional world, that could be, for example, your house. If you have a mortgage, the security that you provide to the bank could be your house, right? In the blockchain world, the smart contract, the vault, will take your collateral, for example, your ether, right? So here, this collateral here that's sent to the MakerDAO smart contract, it will take this as a security. And that, if you get liquidated, that means that a third party can come and purchase this collateral at a discount. Right? So this is that's the concept behind the liquidation.
And you get the price, the discount.
Exactly. So we actually go through a liquidation here in a bit. I will show you the simplest example of a liquidation mechanism in DeFi, which is a fixed spread liquidation. Fixed spread, the term fixed comes from the fact that the discount is fixed. It's pre-agreed. It can be anywhere between 5 and I think 15% in Aave, for instance, right? So you know that, so in the 5%, you may ask 5% relative to what, right? Because that's what matters. Well, relative to the market price, right? So it's as if there's suddenly now there's a market opening that sells an asset at a 5% discount. So why wouldn't you go and buy it, right? It's cheaper than anywhere else. And then you can sell it on the regular market, so to speak, right? So, and this is what I meant as the incentive for liquidators to come in and to execute a liquidation, right? Because it's 5% could be significant in terms of volume. We will look at a few empirical numbers afterwards. Yeah?
Why do you need an off-chain price oracle? Can't you just use the Uniswap smart contracts?
Ah, nice. So why can you not use the Uniswap price to determine an asset? So you can, for on-chain assets only, you can use an Uniswap price or an AMM price in general, but they can be manipulated. We will look into a specific attack this afternoon. We'll go through the exact details of how you manipulate Uniswap to gain millions. Yeah, we'll go through a concrete example actually. There are some, I mean, the community has worked really well to improve the accuracy and the manipulation resistance of on-chain price oracles. There is something called a time-weighted average price oracle. So instead of an AMM providing the spot market price as an oracle, you take an average over a few blocks. But that's also, I mean, one of the drawbacks is a bit of the delayed effect price. And I think there's still, I mean, they have a few drawbacks. I think there was one paper released not too long ago that studied the advantages and disadvantages of TWAPs. But that's ongoing research, really. That's really at the edge at the moment. A very exciting field, by the way. Yeah.
So two packages quite significant. So I would just imagine the role of liquidator seems rather low risk, and I would imagine that everyone would be want to be liquidator, so expect the kind of discount to daily cover the fees if we imagine the center of the market, right? So I guess the question is like, what are the risks of liquidators that justify this?
Okay, right. So the question is, what are the risks that justify a 5% discount, right? It's a good question. I mean, because liquidators could take on flash loans if the profit is big enough, and then you don't even have to have collateral, the asset exposure to the debt that you need to repay. So that would mitigate even further liquidation risks. I guess the risks are really, I think the lending platforms are just, I suppose, worried that nobody will liquidate. I mean, I guess the 5% are, okay, I have to say they are fixed in the smart contract at the time of deployment. So there's not really an efficient market discovery, so to speak, right, for the spread. Whereas in MakerDAO, so MakerDAO, at least before 2021, they had an auction mechanism that would allow for price discovery of the spread, of the liquidation spread. But I guess once you have a fixed spread liquidation where it's just hard-coded in the contract, then they like to err on the side of the liquidators. But your question raises another point, like who is benefiting from a liquidation event, or from a lending platform in general, right? Is a liquidation mechanism benefiting or is it more lenient towards the borrower, or is it more lenient towards the lender? And we will look in particular at one quantification that we try to do to understand how different liquidation mechanisms favor or disfavor a borrower in particular. You have a question?
Yeah, so can liquidation, if you have like too much of a discount and maybe a small market, can't it also just cause like a price decline, like an equivalent?
Spirals. Yep. We do see spirals. I actually have a slide later on that as well. Yep. So liquidations are detrimental because I can't give you quantitative data right now off the bat, but I would guess the majority of the liquidators are selling the collateral immediately, which exerts further price pressure on the collateral, which then causes further liquidations to happen, and this is known as a liquidation spiral. Yep.
In case of, for example, cases who liquidate houses, I understand that they would like to sell the house because they're not in the house. But if you're a bank and the collateral is money, then money is already your business. So why not the people who manage the smart contract or liquidate it themselves? And in this case, they could just take the collateral for themselves without any discount.
So I guess the question is why are people not liquidating themselves or just taking out their loans before the liquidation, or before a position becomes unhealthy, right? Or why are they not topping up the collateral just to avoid liquidation?
Because like why don't the people who manage the smart contract don't just take the collateral, like the full collateral themselves?
The people who manage the smart, what do you mean?
Why doesn't Ahmed do liquidations?
Oh, I mean, liquidations always require some kind of an infrastructure, right, where you observe the blockchain state. I guess if you open up this opportunity to a decentralized network, the market. Well, I'm probably contradicting myself because the 5% is fixed, so there's no market discovery. But one would hope that if you open up a liquidation opportunity to several market participants, that the liquidation will happen and will be efficient, right? Which we have no evidence, at least so far in DeFi. Many of the actions are quite suboptimal, especially on the liquidation front. We will see some examples later. I, for example, also don't understand why price oracles are not doing liquidations. Like Chainlink, why are they not doing liquidations? Or backrunning, right? I mean, the price oracles are triggering liquidations in en masse, right? So why are they not doing this? Because it would reduce some of the transaction load pressure in blockchains. I think there's a lot of suboptimality in general in actions by DeFi actors here.
So why doesn't the lender do the liquidation? And actually, I mean, he's always in a better position when someone liquidates, right? Because he's got an asset that, because he's got more than 100%, he's got an asset that's worth more than that. So you can just sell it at market price and at his own pace so that he doesn't, you know.
I mean, my best guess, and I'm not sure that's correct, is that there's just, you need some amount of infrastructure and real-time infrastructure which reads the blockchain state in time, which acts in time, and all this infrastructure is just so immature at the moment. That's my best guess, right? Because if we could very easily do automated trading in that direction, if everybody could do that, then I feel these markets will get more efficient. Yeah.
Yes. Curious, like, so, like, in Ethereum, particularly, so this is centered around Ethereum. I know that probably for a good reason, but it sounds like it's kind of an arbitrary choice to not allow smart contracts to operate themselves. I'm just curious, like my experience, if we imagine Ethereum without that, so how do you think it would be more efficient in general? Smart contract would actually include liquidations. So.
I think that's what you're referring to is a smart contract can only start executing code if a transaction is calling a function, right? And that's why we need external third parties who trigger that function, who sign a transaction with their private key and send it out so that some action is happening. Now, a much more desirable functionality would be that you can encode some kind of a trigger moment, right, in the smart contract itself, which will then wake up and execute some functionality. I think there are some blockchains who try to implement that or who have already implemented it. And I guess it would definitely be beneficial here. Then you.
Somebody has to provide, like, pay back the debt.
But you could have a pool, right? You can have a pool and you just say, if this event occurs, then I'm willing to pay X amount from my pool, right? And just automate it. And you can sleep, you can be offline, that's fine. The chain will take care of it. Right? Yeah?
The problem with the vertically created loans that is kind of like conflict of interest, like the incentives, like I can manipulate the vertical price and like.
I guess that's why they want to stay away from that. Exactly, they want to stay a bit more neutral. I suppose that's it's more of a political reason. Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
What's the motivation for borrowing when you have to put a coin as a collateral rather than just exchanging the currencies directly? Because if you do it in traditional finance and you mortgage on a house, you can still live in the collateral, you can still live in the house, but why would you not just exchange the currencies for each other and then exchange them back later on?
You could do that. I guess the example here with DAI, or why people choose to mint DAI, is because they use the DAI to exchange it back to Ether, for instance. So if you have one Ether as collateral, right, then your exposure is just one Ether. If you can collateralize the one Ether to get DAI to buy more Ether, then you have a higher exposure to Ether. Right, so you risk, but also your potential reward increases, which is just traditional leverage. Yeah. That's my understanding why people would do DAI loans. Yeah.
Couldn't you say the reason you don't swap is because you don't want to expose yourself to the price, etc. Because you're unsure as well as the prices. So, and you're not like taking such a direction.
That could also be an explanation. Correct. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Do you have a view on, like, in traditional finance, I have some letter position, that position should be private, but the DeFi is public, so I see that the system's really fully levered up. You know, the price. I don't understand, like, this trade-off between having private positions or fully public, or just fully public, then I can anticipate that the system is already fully leveled out, that the liquidation awareness company. So what's your view on that? Would the system be more efficient if we had privacy on the liquidation positions or less efficient?
Oh, so the question is, like in DeFi, as we know it, everything is public, right? So we can know how much the system is levered up. Whereas in the traditional finance, we typically have less of transparency about the debt positions. Which, I mean, so I think there are two things. One, the view that you know how much the system is levered up is quite good, because you can anticipate and it would inform your actions, right? So I think this added transparency is quite interesting. And the second thing is, if you know it's so levered up, then your risk, even if you don't have leverage, is actually quite increased, right? So I feel like this additional transparency helps quite a bit for actors to change their decisions.
Say that I can then attack one single position because I know, it's collateralized right at the limit.
Yeah.
I perturb the price by a little amount.
Exactly. You know how much you need to sell of an asset to modify the market price, such that the position becomes liquidatable, such that the health factor goes below 1. And then you can anticipate that if that happens, how many other debt positions will become liquidatable. Actually, I have a slide for this, which is probably quite relevant. Sorry to jump a bit, but here, so because of this transparency, right, you can, on the x-axis we have the price decline in percentage. And then on the y-axis we have the liquidatable collateral in US dollar. So you can go to all these lending platforms and you can anticipate if the price of the asset, of the collateral declines by a certain percentage, how much collateral will be opened up for liquidation, right? And whenever there's like a spike, like this one here, right? Then if you're close to the spike, right, then you can just tip it over by making a small swap in that direction and trigger this liquidation. Right? And this can all be anticipated automatically. Okay, let me quickly go back. So fixed spread liquidation. Okay, so let's do a liquidation, no? I mean, since we're speaking so much, let's do something practical. All right, we have this example before. We have this position that's where the health factor is now below 1, and we want to fix this, right? So we have, what are the parameters we have? Well, we have the close factor, 0.5, right? So we can pay back 50% of the debt at most. We have a liquidation spread, so we can get 10% of as a benefit, so to speak. So one fixed spread liquidation that we could perform is the following. So close factor 0.5 means we can pay back half of the debt. So half of 1,250 DAI, which is 625 DAI. And then we can claim 687.5 DAI. How did we get 687 DAI? Can anybody help me here? Why did we get that number? Yeah?
It's the 10% spread.
It's the 10% spread, the liquidation spread, exactly. So we repay 625 DAI, right? That means we have 625, and 10% of that is 62.5 DAI, which is the spread. So that's on top. And, well, we would do that. It's rational to do it, right? Because 687 is more than 625, right? So that's why it would be rational to perform this kind of liquidation. I have to add that we will not get DAI immediately, we will get Ether, right? So to get this DAI, we are assuming here in this example, we are assuming that we can swap the Ether immediately to that amount of DAI, which is not necessarily the case. We have seen in the AMM lecture, right? You have slippage, right? Expected and unexpected slippage. Okay, But this is a fixed spread liquidation example. So then the debt position is halved. So now it's at 625. And the remaining collateral is 1 minus 0.43 ether. So now we're healthy again, right? So that position is good. Very simple fixed spread liquidation example, right? So that's all you need to know. Now you can write your own liquidation bot and try it out. You can also write a bot for auction liquidations. So MakerDAO in particular spearheaded this movement of auction liquidation. It works as such. So you have an auction that starts at some point, then you have liquidators, they perform a few bids, and then at some point when the auction terminates, you have one of them who's winning the auction, right? At least this was an example in the older days of MakerDAO. And what's funny is, which we look into, is then the amount of total profits that are sourced from liquidations. So on Monday we looked at roughly the collateral volume that was liquidated, but I didn't show you the profit. But the profit is probably what you're most caring about. So we can see here one particular event which I find interesting is here in March 2020. We have almost 13 million of profit in liquidations coming from MakerDAO. Is this normal? Probably not, no? I mean, this was an outlier event, but otherwise you can see here roughly the liquidation profit from various platforms. Liquidations occur in particular in times of downturns, so when prices go down, because then that's when positions become liquidatable, right? I would just like to ponder a bit about the MakerDAO bot failure. So what happened in March 2020 was that there was some of market collapse. I don't like the word collapse because it doesn't quantify really the price decline, but I think it was about 30 or 40% decline within roughly 24 hours. So then liquidation opportunities arises. The problem when there's a sharp decline in asset prices is that the gas price also increases because people are starting to panic. So the average gas price starts to rise significantly on chain to perform any type of transaction. And the MakerDAO bots who were doing this bidding, right, over time when an auction starts, they failed to act because they were not taking into consideration such strong inclines in gas prices. So it's as if suddenly there are no liquidators. So what happens if there's no liquidators? Then some nifty people are figuring it out. Oh, okay, the bots are not working. Well, then I'm just going to bid a low amount to get the collateral. And that's happened, right? Somebody earned, at the time, I think it was around 30,000 ether for zero DAI. Yeah. So they just bid, because it was literally just because the liquidation bots failed working, right? In times of high gas price volatility. So, and this goes back to my statement that the infrastructure at the moment is just not that professional, right? There's still a lot of room to improve the real-time capabilities of trading there. Yeah, question?
So that was 2020, you said?
This was 2020, yeah.
It sounds like this was before it was popular, because now I can't imagine that someone would miss that.
Well,
what I mean is you would get a lot of bits anyway.
Things have improved since then. Searchers have become much more professional, definitely. Yeah. But we can still see opportunities popping up where people pay or are forgetting to set the right slippage setting, etc. I mean, I have to give an applause to MakerDAO because they changed their liquidation mechanism. That would no longer be possible. The Dutch auction was like you could bid a lower amount and the price would go up over time. Now it's the other way, right? Which is the right way of doing it. So that would not happen anymore. I mean, people learn through these events, but they do happen, or they have happened.
Do you know why they decided to do a Dutch auction mechanism?
I don't know. No. Yeah. So speaking of gas prices, I think it's quite interesting to look like at the, so here we have x-axis over time, and we look on the y-axis as a logarithmic scale of the gas price, and we're looking at three lending platforms, and here the black line is the average gas price, right? So you can see roughly how much gas the liquidators pay. So sometimes they're really quite a bit above the average gas price, because that's a log scale, right? So it's significant. But there are also some cases where they're quite below, right? Here, for example, these on, I think this is compound, yeah. But you can make these statistics, right, and see how much liquidators are paying. And this probably goes back to your question of what's the risk. Well, the risk is that you're failing, right? Your liquidation transaction is failing because there's competition. Yeah. All right, so we already looked into the liquidation sensitivity, right? If there's a price decline, we can anticipate how much collateral will be freed up for liquidation in the future. But I think we wanted to further look a bit into two things. Yeah, what we've seen is you've seen the close factor that we discussed, the 0.5, 50%, right, of the debt can be paid back in one fixed spread liquidation. That's quite a lot. And in some cases, you don't need to pay back 50% of the debt for the debt position to become healthy again. Right? So this close factor is, again, it's a magic number that somebody came up with. It's not, there's no market force or so that's trying to find a better or more optimal parameter. So sometimes that's quite excessive. And there's an optimal liquidation strategy in the fixed spread liquidation case that you could adopt, which is you liquidate up to the close factor, but not necessarily the entire amount, such that the position still remains unhealthy, and then you liquidate a second time. Because that would increase your accumulative close factor that you can exert on a debt position. So we believe this is kind of the optimal liquidation strategy for fixed spread liquidations. Right? So if you thought 50% is a lot, well, you can actually go quite beyond it by doing two successive and atomic liquidations. Yeah. So we looked into, yeah, question?
Is it a good idea to make liquidation so that the health factor goes to 1, like expected? What would be the problem?
What would be the problem of?
You let people liquidate to bring the expected health factor to 1. What would be the problem?
Oh, you mean to force that the liquidation has to the one? Yeah, that could be a way of doing it. Yeah, of avoiding that they do two liquidations. That would be one maybe small fix. Yeah. But maybe in some cases you want to have liquidators that help to render the position healthier, even if it means it's not yet healthy enough, right? I guess the lending platforms should be happy that there are liquidators jumping in. But okay, I'm just speculating on my part here. Yeah. So one thing I like to do in general in research is to try to compare systems or design choices. And so in this chart here, we've tried to compare the different liquidation mechanisms, or rather their parameters, among the fixed spread liquidation platforms out there, which are Aave, Compound, DYDX, and Mekada is actually not a fixed spread; it's an auction system. But what we compared here is a very simple ratio. It's the ratio between the monthly liquidation profit over the borrowing volume. So what that would indicate is that the higher this ratio, the more positive the platform is for liquidators, because then the liquidators will earn more, right? So what would that mean? So if we look here in particular, it means that DYDX is actually the best for liquidators, right? It's over the time frame is the highest. And if we look at DYDX, we find that it has no close factor. So you can pay back the entire debt, 100% in one go. And makes sense, right? This is over liquidation, right? Why does it not have any close factor? So kind of data suggests, and this is really just a very simple ratio that we're looking at. Data suggests that DYDX is kind of the platform that you want to be on if you're a liquidator, relatively speaking to the other mechanisms. Yeah. And you can come up with your own metrics, etc., to compare mechanisms, obviously. Yeah.
So if you're an adversary, can you use flash loans to
Yeah.
impact the market and then liquidate?
Yes, flash loans. So if you flash loan, you need to pay it back, right? So that's why flash loans can typically, I think, not be used in an easy way to trigger liquidations. Maybe I'm wrong, but because you need to find some way to pay back the flash loan at the end, right? So that means you either have to trade back, but there are fees involved. So I would say typically not, I guess, yeah.
You can have just an atomic bounding with a swap. You could have the flash loan, liquidate, swap, pay back, and atomic.
Exactly. So if you find a means to do that, and this is under the condition that the price oracle that's being used to calculate the collateral price is on-chain, right? Because only then you can do an atomic execution of this. So if you, for example, if you have an external price oracle that would update the price after your transactions, then that wouldn't work. Yeah. And on-chain price oracles are always a bit tricky, as we will see in the third lecture today. Yeah, this is in the later lecture on DeFi attacks. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely, it's a zero-sum game. Yeah.
Why would they borrow?
You should not go there if you want to. I mean, I love DYDX because they have free flash loans almost. So that's why I like to advertise them for free flash loans. But in that case, it's not great for borrowers. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. No.
Differences in that ratio might also come from different risks on these platforms, right? So DYDX also might have a higher ratio because on average the collateralization ratio of the borrowers is lower on that platform.
We're not factoring
More liquidation.
Right. Absolutely, we're not factoring many of these other metrics, right? It's a simple ratio here, but it's also we haven't seen any other works that kind of tries to quantify or like compare these lending platforms as such, right? But if you are a professional lender or borrower, then I guess you would want to come up with some metrics to understand which market should I go into, right? And then this is maybe one of the metrics you want to look at. Okay, very good. Yeah, quick question?
Yeah, so it's like, you're saying that DYDX is the best for the liquidators, but what I'm expecting that the liquidators, there would be again this gas fee competition just on DYDX that we have, right?
Exactly.
So it's like, the total must be equal here.
Right. So if a platform is better for liquidators, then it will attract more liquidators, which will attract more competition, which will imply higher gas prices, and then again, it may get less attractive, right? Yeah.
Maybe ask long-term related questions. So this seems what's happening as we have this suboptimal, we don't have a market for this liquidator market. And that's why the market shifts to gas fees, and leads towards wasted resources, wasted transactions. The question is, would you comment on the attempts to avoid that, to maybe introduce this market for the liquidator fee, like to avoid this inefficiency? You mentioned that some platforms need something, but not all.
So I suppose I think you're referring to MEV in general, right? Like how to generate a market for MEV, because the liquidation is just one part of MEV in general. And I think we'll discuss this then, and Lera will discuss this also more in the next lecture.
I was asking if the lending platforms, they have any mechanisms for dynamic adjust this level, it's the spread.
Yeah, but you can think of it in a more general setting, right? There are opportunities out there, and they somehow have to be competed away, and that's MEV, which we'll discuss in the next lecture. Yeah. Okay. So we already mentioned the leveraging spirals. So we have once there's a liquidation, the liquidation occurs because there was a price decline. The liquidation itself may trigger further price decline because the liquidator is selling the collateral further on the open market, which then causes further liquidations, etc. So it's a spiral as we discussed already. So very good. And I think I have only like about 8 minutes left. Yeah, and these are left for stablecoins. So I'll try to go through this briefly. We already mentioned on Monday, right? Stablecoins on a very high level, but I guess you all know we need stablecoins because there's a relatively high volatility in prices in general. So stability is really a relative metric. You get probably different answers depending on who you ask, and people use this volatility or the standard deviation of returns as a metric. You can use the worst drop over a time frame. And also traditional fiat currencies have quite some volatility. But volatility alone may actually not capture the range of prices that are enough. Can anybody explain why that would be the case? Why is volatility not enough to capture stability?
Because if, for example, you take as reference the US dollar, maybe that you use to constantly the reference it's moving, right? So you also need to account for like variation on the reference.
Exactly. So volatility could be a short-term increase or short-term decrease, right? But that's not accounting for a longer time frame variation, right? You could have very little volatility, but just in one direction over time, and then still the asset wouldn't be necessarily stable, right? So volatility by itself doesn't help you define stability as such, right? So we have a few types of stablecoins. We typically have USD derivatives that are built, for example, through reserve-based stablecoins. So this is where a company is collateralizing part or all of the assets. We have collateral-based, like MakerDAO, which we already discussed, and we have algorithmic, a bit more experimental stablecoins, which we also discussed very briefly. And then on the other side, we have pegged coins, which are derivatives of mostly of other cryptocurrency assets, such as the wrapped Bitcoin or the SD Ether. So if you, for example, if you want to become a validator without running a validator node, you can do this so-called liquid staking, where you deposit Ether into a pool, and then other nodes are using this Ether to run validator on your behalf. So we see this pegged and USD derivatives in general, and they're all quite related also in some way. Although I haven't seen reserve-based. Oh no, actually, wrapped Bitcoin I think is a reserve-based pegged coin. So there's supposed to be a company that collateralizes Bitcoin and then mints Bitcoin on the Ethereum blockchain. And that also informs your risk profile, right? You want to know who is this entity, how are they regulated, how do they have audits, etc. You can go to various websites to kind of quantify how much volume is being minted on these stablecoins. So this is just one example. And obviously, as we discussed already, you can also look at traditional fiat currencies. They may not be that stable if you consider a longer time horizon. So how do stablecoin works? So there are a few examples that we can go through. I think MakerDAO is probably the easiest. We have already looked at it. This is similar to a previous slide that we looked at, right? It's really the same. So we collateralize Ether, we mint DAI. Synthetics is interesting because we can collateralize a token of that system. And you can see here the collateral ratio is quite significant. It's like 600%. Well, obviously because this asset may be highly volatile and we don't know what will happen to it. Right? But we can then take external price oracles to mint derivatives, for example, of a real world stock. Right? That's a possibility. And then we can pay it back, very similar to the MakerDAO example. Right? So you can think of this being also a type of derivative or stablecoin asset with an external price dependency. Then we have algorithmic stablecoins like Ampleforth, where there's no collateral at all, which sounds quite scary. But the high-level idea of how it works is that we have a smart contract, and we have an external price oracle, and this price oracle reports the USD price to the stablecoin. Right, so that's just the external price oracle. And the smart contract does 3 things. So if the ample price is above $1 as reported by the price oracle, then we inflate the volume. We mint new coins, we mint new ample to decrease its value. If the value is below $1, right, then the smart contract will remove supply. Right? So it can burn tokens. Right? You have them in your wallet, but the ERC20 contract can burn what's in your wallet. Right? They are at the end of the day accounting for how much is in your wallet. And if it's exactly $1, then no action is taken. Right? So these have been shown to be highly non-stable. So yeah, question.
How do they choose where to work from?
So on the implementation side, if you look at an ERC20, the contract has a list of accounts, right, and how much balance they have each, and that's why the smart contract can burn, so to speak, the proportional amount. So if you have 10% of the supply, you may still have 10% of the supply, but the supply decreased. Yeah. Yeah. Another question. Yeah.
So in the Ampleforth case, this supply, remove supply is from the holders, right? It's not external where I mint or...
Exactly.
So yeah. That's why you say it's like this is unstable, but otherwise if it was, I mean if there was some, I know if it's not from the user but somehow externally done, then would that make more sense? Would it be more stable? Because you said this is unstable, right?
It would be more stable if we do what?
If we don't, because, I mean, in the Ampleforth case, we just play with what the holder is displayed, essentially, right? And then, if we apply this idea of add supply, remove supply, but not from the holder, but have some sort of, I don't know, like a bank of this thing, and then I add or remove based on some other assets that I hold, like...
I encourage you to try it in real world. But be careful on the legal side.
Okay.
This is no financial advice. Right, okay. Yeah, we just have a few more slides. Okay, so again, here the fundamental assumption of why this should work, and I'm not saying it does work, is that the scarcity determines the price, which is not always the case, right? So that's just one of the assumptions that may not always hold. So there may be some systemic implications of how this works. I think we already looked at USDC and USDT. They are full of fractional reserve coins. And yeah, I have 2 more slides. So just if you think of it more conceptually, so you can have exogenous or endogenous variables, right? So an exogenous variable would be if you have some outside force, right, that is imposed on your model. Like in the example of MakerDAO, so the asset price of the collateral, like ETH, right, is really independent of MakerDAO as a platform, right? MakerDAO is quite independent of that. But an endogenous variable would be where it's determined by the model, and it seems like these are in general less stable, which kind of makes sense, right? They're more like intertwined, more dependent. So in synthetics, the example I gave, you really have an arbitrary derivative that you can mint, and it's backed by this one collateral that depends on the project itself. So it seems by definition that it may be more prone to fluctuations or maybe manipulations. So you can kind of try to map stablecoins, I feel, in this kind of form where you have on the one axis you have the collateral type, which may be of exogenous or endogenous nature or both, or you have no collateral, which would be the algorithmic stablecoins. And then we have these three types of stablecoins that we discussed, right? We have reserve-based, so money, hopefully in the bank, crypto collateralized, or then algorithmic. Yeah. And this is just a high-level overview. Yeah. But again, we could have an entire week on stablecoins. So thank you.